A poor Omega fed an injured wolf pup. The next morning, the Alpha King knocked on her door. "Hello, everyone." Before the sun rose over Pine Hollow, Elena Whitmore would give away the last food she owned to a creature the forest had already marked for death, and by morning, nothing in her quiet life would remain untouched. If stories of courage, kindness, and destiny speak to your heart, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell to help our channel grow. Now, let us return to the night one forgotten Omega chose mercy over hunger. Elena stood at the edge of the Pine Hollow market with 3 copper coins pressed into her palm and the weight of a dozen watching eyes on her back. The winter wind slipped through the seams of her faded brown coat, carrying the scents of wood smoke, roasted meat, and fresh bread she could not afford. At 22, she had learned how to make herself small in crowded places. Small enough that merchants did not complain when she lingered near their stalls. Small enough that high-ranking wolves forgot she existed. Small enough, she hoped, that Vivian Prescott might pass without noticing her. "Still counting pennies, Elena?" Vivian's voice came sweetly, which only made the cruelty beneath it sharper. Elena looked up. The Alpha's daughter stood beside a wagon draped in blue velvet, her honey-blonde hair pinned beneath a fur-lined hood. 2 young women hovered near her, smiling before Vivian had even said anything amusing. Elena closed her fingers around the coins. "I only need a little flour." "A little flour," Vivian repeated, glancing toward the baker. "Put it on her family account." The baker's expression tightened. Elena's family had no account. Everyone knew that. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, had died 2 winters earlier, leaving behind a one-room cabin, a box of healing supplies, and debts Elena could never quite outrun. Laughter moved through the nearby crowd in soft, embarrassed ripples. Vivian tilted her head. "Oh, that's right. There is no family left to pay it." Heat rose beneath Elena's skin, but she kept her shoulders straight. Her mother had taught her that dignity was not something another person could hand you, and therefore it was not something they could truly take away. "I'll manage," Elena said. She placed 2 coins on the counter and accepted the smallest heel of bread the baker could spare. It was hard enough to crack against stone, but it would last until morning if she softened it in hot water. Vivian's gaze dropped to the bread, then returned to Elena's face. "You Omegas are always so grateful for scraps." Elena did not answer. She turned away before anger could make her careless. The walk home wound beyond the last cottages and into the pine woods, where the trees crowded close and the snow lay untouched beneath their branches. Her cabin waited nearly a mile from the village, alone beside a narrow creek. Most people pitied her for living so far out. Elena preferred the silence. Trees did not measure worth by rank. Snow did not laugh. She had nearly reached the old footbridge when she heard the sound. A faint whimper. Elena stopped. The forest went still around her. Then it came again, thin, broken, and frightened. She followed it through the brush, pushing aside branches until she found a fallen cedar. Beneath its roots lay a small wolf pup with silver-gray fur darkened by mud and blood. One hind leg was caught beneath a twisted length of wire, and its sides trembled with every shallow breath. "Oh, sweetheart," Elena whispered. The pup bared tiny teeth, too weak to make the warning convincing. Elena lowered herself slowly, ignoring the cold soaking through her skirt. "I know. You're scared." Its eyes were a startling blue, bright even through pain. She reached for the wire, and the pup snapped at her hand. Elena did not pull away. "You can bite me if you need to," she murmured. "But I'm not leaving you here." It took several minutes to free the trapped leg. By then, her fingers were numb and bleeding where the wire had cut them. Elena wrapped the pup in her coat and carried it home against her chest. Inside the cabin, she lit one lamp, warmed water, and cleaned the wound with the last of her mother's dried yarrow. The pup watched her from a blanket near the hearth, wary but no longer snarling. Elena set the hard bread into a bowl, softened it with broth, and placed it within reach. Her own stomach cramped at the smell. "Go on," she said softly. "You need it more than I do." The pup hesitated, then began to eat. Elena smiled despite the ache in her chest. Outside, snow started falling over Pine Hollow, covering the path to her door. But sometime after midnight, while Elena slept in the chair beside the fire, the pup lifted its head toward the distant road and listened to something only it could hear. By dawn's first gray light, Elena had not slept more than a few minutes at a time. Each time the fire settled, the pup stirred beneath Margaret's old wool blanket, and Elena woke with her heart already racing. She checked the injured leg again, relieved to find the bleeding slowed, though the swelling remained. "You're stubborn," she whispered, warming a clean cloth between her palms. "That may be the only reason you're still alive." The little wolf watched her with guarded blue eyes, no longer snapping when she touched him. Trust had not come easily, but it had come. That mattered to Elena more than she wanted to admit. She had spent 2 years in a house so quiet that even her own footsteps sometimes felt like an intrusion. Caring for another living thing made the room feel less empty. When she shifted the blanket, a patch of white fur appeared at the center of the pup's chest, curved like a slender moon. Elena paused. The marking was too precise to be ordinary, but she told herself she was imagining significance because exhaustion had made her foolish. Then her fingers brushed something beneath the thick fur at his neck. A narrow leather collar, nearly hidden under mud, had been cut through rather than unfastened. Attached to it was a jagged fragment of silver, no larger than her thumbnail. One edge showed part of an engraved symbol, perhaps a crown, perhaps spreading antlers, though too little remained to know for certain. The pup jerked away when Elena examined it. "All right," she said gently, releasing the collar. "I won't take it." His ears lowered, as if he understood. She placed another spoonful of softened bread near him, but he only sniffed it. There was nothing left to add except warm water and a pinch of dried herbs. Elena had used the last of the broth during the night. Her own hunger had dulled into a heavy ache beneath her ribs. The pup looked from the bowl to her face. For one strange moment, Elena felt as though he knew. She turned away before she could become sentimental over an animal she might have to release by evening. Beyond the cabin, the storm had buried the forest beneath fresh snow. Farther north, where the royal road cut through the pines, Miles Bennett dismounted beside a patch of crimson staining the white ground. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers to the frozen track. "Small wolf," one of the guards said behind him. "Injured." Miles's jaw tightened. They had searched through the night, spreading men across every trail between the river and Pine Hollow. The young heir's scent had vanished after the rain, then returned only in fragments: fear, blood, wet fur. "No hunting horns," Miles ordered. "No shouting. He'll run if he hears strangers." Another guard pointed toward a broken branch leading east. Beneath it lay a strip of dark leather. Miles recognized the stitching at once. "Royal issue." He closed his hand around it. "Send word to the king. We've found the trail." Back at the cabin, Elena tried to coax the pup to drink. When she lifted the bowl, he startled and caught her wrist between his teeth. Pain flashed up her arm, but she did not strike him or wrench free. She stayed still, breathing through it. "You thought I was going to hurt you," she murmured. "I understand." The pressure eased. His jaws opened, leaving shallow marks across her skin. Elena set the bowl down and extended her injured hand, palm upward. Slowly, the pup leaned forward and touched his nose to her fingers. The gesture was so careful that her throat tightened. "There you are," she whispered. Outside, something moved beyond the trees. Not the light step of a deer or the restless scrape of a fox. Hooves. Several of them. The pup's head snapped toward the door, every muscle suddenly tense. Elena rose, reaching for the iron poker beside the hearth. Through the frosted window, dark shapes passed between the pines, moving slowly toward her cabin. Then the pup stood despite his wounded leg, positioned himself in front of Elena, and gave a low, trembling growl at whoever was coming. The growl coming from the injured pup was far too steady for such a small creature. Elena tightened her grip on the iron poker, every instinct urging her to shield him despite knowing she had little chance against armed strangers. Hooves stopped outside the cabin. For a heartbeat, the forest fell silent except for the wind brushing against the frozen branches. Then came 3 measured knocks. Not hurried, not violent, deliberate. Elena hesitated before opening the door only wide enough to see who stood outside. The man at the front seemed carved from winter itself. Broad shoulders disappeared beneath a dark traveling cloak dusted with snow, while piercing blue eyes surveyed the room with calm restraint instead of suspicion. A narrow scar traced the side of his face, lending him an air that was both commanding and deeply worn. Behind him waited nearly a dozen mounted guards, every one of them watching the cabin with disciplined focus. Another man stepped forward first. His blonde hair was damp from melted snow, and the wolf insignia fastened to his cloak marked him as someone of rank. "My name is Miles Bennett," he said evenly. "We're searching for someone who disappeared during the night." Elena neither opened the door wider nor stepped back. "There's no one here except me." Before Miles could answer, a soft whine drifted from behind Elena. The tall stranger's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not relief. Recognition. The pup pushed past Elena's skirts despite favoring his injured leg. For the first time since she had found him beneath the fallen cedar, he ignored the pain completely. He crossed the floor as quickly as he could, stopping only a few feet from the man in the doorway. The stranger slowly lowered himself onto one knee, as though approaching a frightened child rather than an animal. "Easy, Rowan," he said quietly. The pup released a broken cry and stumbled into his waiting arms. Elena's breath caught. "Rowan." The little wolf buried his face against the man's shoulder, trembling until the shaking gradually eased. The stranger rested one hand over the crescent marking hidden beneath the silver-gray fur, closing his eyes for only a moment. When he finally looked back toward Elena, gratitude softened features that otherwise seemed built for command. "Thank you," he said simply. "You brought him home." Elena stared from the pup to the gathered soldiers. "You know him?" Miles exchanged a glance with the kneeling man before answering. "He belongs with us." Elena noticed the careful wording. "Belongs with us." Not owns him. Not captured him. Something about that choice unsettled her curiosity even more. "He was caught in a wire trap," she replied. "His leg needs another day before he should travel." The stranger gently examined Rowan's injury. His jaw tightened at the sight of the swollen limb and the cuts hidden beneath freshly wrapped cloth. "Someone cleaned this properly," he murmured. "My mother taught me enough to keep wounds from turning bad," Elena answered. "It wasn't much. It was everything." His quiet reply carried a weight that surprised her. Rowan lifted his head and nudged Elena's hand before settling back against the man's chest, as though unwilling to choose between them. Miles noticed the gesture and allowed himself the faintest smile. "He trusts very few people," he observed. "Apparently you've become one of them." Elena looked down, embarrassed by the attention. He was frightened. "So was the kingdom," the stranger answered. Silence stretched between them. Elena finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had lingered since dawn. "Who are you?" Before anyone spoke, every guard behind the cloaked man lowered one fist across his chest in perfect unison. Even Miles bowed his head. The movement happened so naturally that Elena understood its meaning before she heard the words. "Your Majesty," Miles said respectfully, "the heir has been found." Elena's heartbeat seemed to stop. She looked back at the man kneeling inside her humble cabin, at the exhausted wolf pup sleeping safely against his shoulder, and at the fragment of silver collar still resting on her wooden table. The stranger rose slowly, meeting her stunned gaze without arrogance. "I am Declan Hawthorne," he said, "Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Elena remained frozen for several heartbeats. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories stood inside her humble cabin, snow melting from the hem of his dark cloak onto floorboards worn smooth by years of quiet living. Yet the man before her looked nothing like the ruthless ruler described in village gossip. His entire attention rested on the exhausted wolf pup sleeping peacefully against his chest, as though nothing else in the room mattered. Rowan stirred unexpectedly, letting out a faint whimper. Before Declan could calm him, the frightened child instinctively reached toward Elena instead. Without thinking, she stepped closer and gently brushed a loose strand of silver-gray fur away from his eyes. "You're safe now," she whispered. Rowan's breathing slowed almost immediately. Even asleep, one small paw wrapped around her fingers and refused to let go. Silence settled across the cabin. Several royal guards exchanged surprised glances, while Miles Bennett quietly lowered his eyes. Declan watched the simple gesture without speaking. During the endless search through the frozen forest, Rowan had rejected every healer, every guard, even members of the royal household. Yet after only one night with this poor Omega, he reached for her as naturally as a frightened child reached for home. Declan carefully shifted Rowan into one arm, allowing the boy to keep holding Elena's hand for as long as he wished. "You protected more than his life," Declan said at last, his voice lower than before. "You gave him a place where he felt safe." Elena looked embarrassed by the praise. He was scared, she answered softly. Anyone would have done the same. Miles glanced around the tiny cabin. The empty shelves, the cracked kettle above fading coals, the patched blanket covering the narrow bed. He knew that statement was untrue. Most people would have walked away rather than surrender their last food to an injured wild animal. Declan reached inside his cloak and placed a heavy leather pouch on the table beside a parchment bearing the royal seal. Gold coins clinked softly together. "This deed grants you land near the capital," he said. "The gold is yours. A residence inside the royal grounds can also be prepared if you wish." Elena looked at the pouch only briefly before her eyes drifted toward Margaret's worn medicine box resting beside the fireplace. She remembered her mother's quiet voice reminding her that kindness lost its meaning the moment it expected payment. After a thoughtful silence, she gently pushed both gifts back toward the king. Even Miles drew a slow breath. None of them had expected refusal. "Is my gratitude unwelcome?" Declan asked. Elena shook her head immediately. "Your gratitude is enough." She hesitated before continuing. "If your majesty truly wishes to repay me, please remove the wire traps hidden throughout these woods. I found Rowan because one of them nearly killed him. Next time it could be another child, or someone with no one searching for them." The words lingered long after she finished speaking. Declan held her gaze, searching for selfishness, ambition, or calculation. He found none. For perhaps the first time in many years, someone had asked the Alpha King for nothing that would benefit herself. Something quiet shifted inside him, not affection yet, but profound respect. "By tomorrow," he promised, "every trap my guards can find will be destroyed." Before Elena could answer, hurried footsteps crunched across the snow outside. A hard knock echoed through the cabin. "Open this door," a familiar voice demanded. Elena's heart tightened instantly. She recognized Gideon Prescott before touching the latch. Vivian stood beside her father wrapped in expensive winter furs. Several local guards gathered behind them. Gideon's practiced smile appeared the moment he noticed the royal horses outside, but it disappeared almost as quickly when his eyes landed on Rowan resting safely in Declan's arms. Then he noticed the broken silver collar fragment lying on the table beside the lamp. His expression sharpened with calculation. "Your Majesty," Gideon said with another respectful bow. "Perhaps the first question we should ask is why a poor Omega chose to hide something so valuable inside her home." Gideon Prescott allowed the accusation to linger in the silence, knowing suspicion often spread faster than truth. Vivian folded her arms with practiced elegance, her eyes fixed on Elena as though the answer had already been decided. "The entire territory has been searching for that wolf," she said. "Yet somehow it ended up hidden in the home of the poorest Omega in Pine Hollow. That seems convenient." Elena felt every pair of eyes shift toward her, but before she could speak, Rowan stirred. He raised his head from Declan's shoulder, spotted Gideon, and immediately shrank back with a frightened whimper. His body trembled so violently that even Miles noticed. Declan's expression hardened. He gently rested one hand against Rowan's back until the shaking eased, never taking his eyes off Gideon. "Children rarely fear without reason," he said quietly. Gideon forced a laugh. "He's exhausted, Your Majesty. He hardly knows where he is." "Perhaps," Declan replied. "Or perhaps he remembers more than we realize." The room grew colder despite the fire. Gideon's smile faltered for the briefest instant before returning. "If Your Majesty permits, my guards can escort Miss Whitmore to the village while we investigate how she came into possession of the royal heir." Elena's heartbeat quickened. She understood exactly what would happen if Gideon controlled the questions. No one in Pine Hollow had ever won an argument against its alpha. Before fear could steal her voice, she stepped forward. "I found him trapped beneath a fallen cedar," she said steadily. "He was alone. His leg was caught in wire. I brought him here because leaving him would have meant watching him die." Vivian tilted her head. "And you expect everyone to believe such an extraordinary story?" "It isn't extraordinary," Elena answered. "It's simply what happened." Declan crossed the room until he stood beside the small wooden table. His gaze settled on the torn collar fragment Elena had left untouched. He picked it up carefully, turning the silver beneath the lamplight. The broken edge fit perfectly against the leather strip Miles had recovered in the forest. Neither man spoke, yet understanding passed between them. Someone had cut Rowan free from his collar before abandoning him. That had not happened by accident. Miles quietly accepted both pieces and slipped them into a leather pouch. "These will remain in royal custody," he announced. Gideon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Naturally, Declan faced Elena again. "You said the trap was made from twisted wire." She nodded. "Heavy enough to hold something much larger than him. Can you lead us there?" Elena hesitated. The trail remained buried beneath fresh snow, and returning would mean standing against the most powerful family in her territory. Once she guided the king to that place, there would be no pretending she had simply rescued a lost animal. Every lie, every hidden trap, every secret buried beneath the forest floor would begin to surface. Her quiet life would disappear forever. She looked toward the old cabinet where Margaret's worn medicine box rested beside the silver leaf pendant her mother had cherished. Everything Elena loved existed inside this little cabin. Yet she remembered Rowan's frightened eyes and the pain she had seen carved into his injured leg. She could not protect the truth by remaining silent. Slowly, she lifted her winter cloak from its peg. "Yes," she said, "I can take you there." Rowan watched her with solemn blue eyes, then reached one small paw toward her before Declan adjusted his hold. The simple gesture tightened something deep inside the Alpha King's chest. He had crossed half the kingdom searching for his nephew, expecting to find only disaster. Instead, he had found an Omega whose courage refused to bend even when standing alone. Declan turned toward Miles. "Prepare the horses." Gideon's pulse visibly quickened. "Your Majesty, surely this can wait until the weather clears." Declan's voice remained controlled, leaving no room for argument. "No. Every hour gives whoever set that trap another chance to erase what they left behind." As the royal guard moved into formation outside, Vivian exchanged a brief, uneasy glance with her father. Elena noticed it. So did Miles. Neither said a word. But when the procession finally left the cabin and entered the silent forest, more than one person realized they were no longer searching for the place where Rowan had fallen. They were following a path that could expose someone who had worked very hard to keep the truth buried beneath the snow. The journey through the snow-covered forest unfolded beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Elena walked ahead, her boots sinking into fresh drifts while the royal guard followed at a careful distance. Declan carried Rowan wrapped securely inside his traveling cloak, and although the young heir remained quiet, his gaze never wandered far from Elena. Whenever she glanced back to check on him, he answered with the smallest nod, as though reminding himself she was still there. After nearly an hour, Elena stopped beside the fallen cedar where she had first discovered him. The broken branches still leaned across the clearing, but the wire trap itself was gone. Only deep impressions remained where something heavy had been dragged away. Gideon folded his arms. It seems the poor girl remembered the wrong place after all. His confidence lasted only until Miles crouched beside the disturbed snow. He brushed away a thin layer of ice and uncovered several twisted strands of rusted wire that had snapped during hurried removal. A few feet farther away, he found dark stains frozen into the earth beneath the white surface. "Blood," he said quietly. Declan lowered Rowan onto a blanket while Elena knelt beside the exposed ground. The young wolf immediately became restless. His breathing quickened, and he refused to look toward the place where the trap had been. Elena slowly sat beside him instead of reaching for him. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered. Rowan's shoulders remained tense. Remembering how frightened animals often calmed when someone shared their space instead of forcing comfort upon them, Elena simply rested her hand on the snow between them. After several long moments, Rowan cautiously placed his small hand over hers. His breathing gradually steadied. Then his eyes fixed on a nearby pine tree. He lifted one trembling finger toward its trunk. Miles crossed the clearing and brushed away snow covering the bark. Carved into the wood was the unmistakable outline of a hawk with outstretched wings. "This mark," one guard murmured. "I've seen it before." Gideon's face lost all color for the briefest instant. "Many hunters carve symbols," he answered too quickly. "It proves nothing." Elena studied the carving. "When I found Rowan, he kept looking toward this tree." Declan approached silently. "Do you recognize the emblem?" Miles stood, his expression grave. "Not from the royal guard." Before anyone could continue, another voice broke through the clearing. "I do." Every head turned. Caleb Finch stepped nervously from behind the trees, clutching his wool cap with both hands. His cheeks were pale, and his breathing came in uneven bursts after what looked like a long run. Gideon stared at him with open warning. You weren't summoned here. Caleb swallowed hard, but kept walking until he faced the king. I had to come. His voice shook. That hawk belongs to the private hunting crews hired by House Prescott. Silence swept across the clearing. Vivian immediately stepped forward. He's lying. Caleb looked toward Elena before gathering enough courage to continue. Last month, Lord Prescott ordered new wire traps placed deeper inside the royal forest because deer had stopped crossing the southern fields. We were told never to speak about it. Gideon's expression hardened into something far colder than anger. Think carefully before accusing your alpha. Caleb's hands trembled, yet he did not retreat. I helped carry the wire. I wish I hadn't. Rowan suddenly flinched, clutching Elena's sleeve with surprising strength. His frightened eyes remained locked on Gideon. Then, with visible effort, he raised his free hand and traced a small hawk in the air exactly as it appeared on the tree. Declan watched the gesture without speaking, but something shifted behind his eyes. This was no longer merely an investigation into an illegal trap. His nephew remembered enough to connect his fear to the same symbol Caleb had identified. Miles carefully wrapped the broken wire and carved bark as evidence before turning toward the king. Your Majesty, he said quietly, we have enough to begin asking far more dangerous questions. Declan looked once toward Gideon, then down at Rowan, holding tightly to Elena's hand. No, he replied in a voice that carried across the silent forest. We have enough to bring every wolf in Pine Hollow before judgment. By sunset, the king's summons had reached every household in Pine Hollow. Villagers crowded the ancient square where generations of alphas had passed judgment, yet no one spoke above a whisper. Declan Hawthorne stood upon the weathered stone platform with Rowan beside him, the young heir wrapped in a dark cloak, his healing legs still unsteady. Elena remained several steps away, uncomfortable beneath so many watchful eyes. Gideon Prescott approached with the confidence of a man who had ruled too long without being questioned, while Vivian followed behind, her face pale with uncertainty. Miles Bennett placed 3 items upon the judgment table: the weathered ledger from the Prescott hunting lodge, the broken silver collar, and the rusted wire recovered from the forest. These were found during the royal investigation, he announced. Together they reveal illegal hunting inside protected royal lands. Gideon barely looked at them. Suspicion is not proof, he replied calmly. My family has served this territory faithfully for decades. Declan remained silent. His silence carried more weight than anger. Rowan suddenly stopped breathing. His eyes locked onto Gideon's hunting coat, and his entire body began to shake. Elena crossed the square without hesitation and quietly knelt beside him. She did not ask him to remember. She simply offered her hand. Rowan clung to it with desperate strength as she whispered, You're safe now. No one can hurt you here. His breathing slowly steadied. Courage returned one heartbeat at a time. Without anyone leading him, Rowan stepped forward until he stood only a few feet from Gideon. The square became so still that even the wind seemed to disappear. From his pocket, Rowan removed the small brass button and placed it into Declan's hand. His voice trembled. The words caught in his throat. Elena smiled gently through tears. Take your time. Rowan closed his eyes, drew one careful breath, and looked directly at Gideon. He cut my collar, he whispered. A wave of disbelief swept through the crowd. Then Rowan gathered every ounce of courage he had left. He pushed me toward the trap. I cried for help. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He said, no one would ever come for me. Silence settled over Pine Hollow like falling snow. Vivian staggered backward, horror replacing every trace of pride. Caleb stepped forward with tears in his own eyes. I repaired Lord Prescott's hunting coat the next morning because one button had been torn away. He ordered me never to ask what happened. Miles pressed the brass button against the empty place on Gideon's collar. It matched perfectly. Gideon's composure finally collapsed. He's confused, he shouted. He's only a frightened child. Declan descended the platform and stopped directly before him. A frightened child, he said quietly, has shown more courage today than you have shown in your entire life. Gideon's anger turned toward Elena. She filled his head with lies. He lunged in her direction. Before anyone else could move, Declan stepped between them, shielding Elena completely. His voice rang across the square. The woman who fed my heir when she had nothing left to give will never stand alone again. No one spoke. For several long moments, the entire village simply looked at Elena. The same Omega they had watched leave the market carrying nothing but a crust of bread now stood beneath the protection of the Alpha King, not because she had sought power, but because she had chosen kindness when no one was watching. One by one, villagers lowered their heads in quiet respect. Some who had laughed at her in the marketplace could no longer meet her eyes. Others stepped away from Gideon without being ordered. Vivian slowly removed the Prescott crest from her cloak. Caleb stood taller than he ever had before. Declan finally turned back toward Gideon. "Gideon Prescott," he declared, "you are stripped of your rank, your lands, and your authority. You will answer before the High Court for crimes against the crown and against your own people." Royal guards immediately placed him in chains. As Gideon was led away, Rowan instinctively returned to Elena's side and slipped his hand into hers. Declan watched them quietly, understanding at last that the future of his kingdom would never be secured by fear alone. It would be built by the quiet courage of ordinary people, and it had begun with a poor Omega who had shared her last piece of bread with a frightened wolf pup. The morning after Gideon Prescott was taken away, Pine Hollow awakened to a silence unlike any it had known before. For years, people had crossed the marketplace pretending not to notice Elena Whitmore. This time, they stepped aside to let her pass. Some offered quiet smiles. Others lowered their heads in silent respect. No speeches were needed. The village had finally seen the woman she had always been. Beyond the square, the sound of axes echoed through the forest. Under Miles Bennett's command, royal workers dismantled every illegal wire trap hidden beneath the snow. Caleb worked beside them from sunrise until dusk without once asking for recognition. When the last twisted snare was pulled from the frozen earth, Miles handed the worn wire cutters to Elena. "Keep them," he said. "Not because you'll need them again, but because someone should remember what this forest used to be." Elena placed the cutters inside Margaret's medicine satchel beside her dried herbs. Some reminders deserved to be carried, even after the danger had passed. Later that afternoon, Vivian approached carrying a basket of fresh bandages and medicinal plants. She stopped several steps away, uncertain whether she had earned the right to speak. "I can't undo what happened," she said quietly, "but I'd like to help, if you'll allow me." Elena looked at the basket before meeting Vivian's eyes. "Then don't help me," she answered gently. "Help the people your family forgot." Vivian nodded once and walked toward a group of elderly villagers waiting outside the old meeting hall. It was the first time she had ever chosen service over status. That evening, Rowan woke with a frightened cry, trapped inside memories he could not escape. Guards hurried toward him, but he recoiled instinctively from every unfamiliar hand. Elena sat beside him without speaking. She simply rested her hand over his and softly hummed the lullaby Margaret had once sung to frightened children. Little by little, Rowan's breathing slowed. His fingers relaxed around hers until he finally drifted back to sleep, leaning peacefully against her shoulder. Declan watched from the doorway. For the first time in years, he wished he had learned how to comfort a frightened child instead of only how to command an army. The realization stayed with him long after the cabin had grown quiet. The next morning, before leaving Pine Hollow, Declan gathered the village elders beneath the old oak tree instead of issuing another royal decree from horseback. "Justice ended yesterday," he told them. "Now healing begins." He ordered the abandoned Prescott estate to become a refuge for Omegas, orphaned children, injured animals, and anyone left without protection. It would be supported by the crown, but cared for by the people themselves. Even Miles looked at his king with quiet surprise. The strongest order Declan had given all week was not one that punished wrongdoing, but one that created hope. As evening settled over the valley, Declan returned to Elena's cabin with Rowan. There were no guards, no banners, and no ceremony waiting outside. 3 simple cups of herbal tea rested between them while snowmelt dripped gently from the roof. After a long, comfortable silence, Declan finally spoke. "Would you come to the capital?" Elena traced the rim of her cup before answering. "If I come because I saved Rowan, people will always believe I accepted a reward." Declan smiled faintly. "Then don't come because of what you've already done." His eyes met hers. "Come because there are still people waiting for someone willing to open a door when everyone else walks past." Rowan looked from one of them to the other before smiling. "Wherever Elena goes," he said softly, "it feels like home." Elena lowered her eyes, her fingers resting against Margaret's pendant beneath her coat. For the first time since she had found a frightened wolf pup beneath the fallen cedar, she realized the hardest decision before her was no longer whether she was brave enough to help someone in need. It was whether she was brave enough to believe she deserved the future quietly waiting beyond her own front door. Before sunrise, Elena had already made her choice. Spring had returned to Pine Hollow, carrying birdsong through the pines where rusted wire traps had once hidden beneath the snow. The little cabin beside the creek had changed without ever becoming larger. Its door stood open from morning until evening, welcoming injured travelers, frightened children, abandoned animals, and anyone who needed kindness more than questions. Margaret's silver leaf pendant rested against Elena's heart as she arranged fresh herbs across the old wooden table. The familiar medicine satchel hung beside the doorway, worn by years of careful hands and quiet compassion. Nothing inside the cabin was expensive, yet every corner carried the warmth of a place where no one was ever turned away. Caleb arrived each week with flour, firewood, and whatever repairs needed doing. Vivian came just as faithfully, tending herb gardens, preparing meals, and changing bandages beside Elena without asking for recognition. Forgiveness had never been spoken aloud between them. It had simply become part of the work they shared. Just as Declan had promised, the abandoned Prescott estate had become a refuge for Omegas, orphaned children, injured animals, and families with nowhere else to go. The forest slowly healed as well. Young wolves crossed old trails without fear, while children wandered beneath the pines where danger had once waited beneath the snow. Rowan visited whenever his lessons at the palace allowed. He no longer announced himself. Elena always heard his laughter before she saw him racing across the little footbridge toward the cabin. One afternoon, after helping bandage an injured fox, Rowan looked around the crowded room and smiled. "No one is afraid here anymore." Elena rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then promise me you'll help others feel the same wherever life takes you." Rowan nodded without hesitation. "I promise." Months later, familiar footsteps stopped outside the porch. Declan had come alone. There were no royal guards, no banners, and no urgent search waiting beyond the trees. For a quiet moment, he simply looked at the weathered wooden door where everything had begun. The first time he had stood there, he carried fear in his heart and believed he might lose the child he loved. Today, he carried only gratitude. Before he could knock, the door slowly opened. Elena smiled as though she had been expecting him all along. Neither of them hurried to speak. They had long since learned that silence could say everything words could not. Declan looked beyond her into the warm little cabin. Rowan sat at the table helping two younger children sort dried herbs while soft laughter drifted through the room. An injured hawk rested peacefully near the hearth, and fresh bread cooled on the windowsill. It was not a palace. Yet, standing there, Declan realized it was the safest place in his kingdom. He met Elena's eyes. "The first time I came here," he said quietly, "I thought I was searching for Rowan." A gentle smile crossed his face. "Instead, I found the future I never knew my kingdom needed." Elena stepped aside, leaving the doorway open between them. "Then come inside," she whispered. "There's always room." Declan crossed the threshold, not because he was a king, but because he had been welcomed. Elena quietly closed the door behind them as Rowan looked up and smiled, already making space for one more chair at the table. Outside, the spring breeze carried the scent of pine across the peaceful forest. Inside, warmth, laughter, and quiet conversation filled the little cabin that had once known only loneliness. And long after the last traces of winter disappeared from Pine Hollow, people still remembered the place where everything had changed, not because a king had knocked upon a poor Omega's door, but because she had chosen to open it.